Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil and today we're going to talk about F-curves. If you go through my Instagram or my Bookstagram specifically, then you'll find that a lot of my animations are floating animations. The majority of my book reviews have the book floating in an organic manner, and that is what we are going to talk about today. To know that, we also have to know how to add keyframes and animate. So let's import an object. I'm going to import my bee from the Buzzwordathon or the Buzzword Challenge that I've been participating in throughout the year. It's a year-long challenge, and each month there's a prompt that we have to choose the book based on. It's created by Books and Lala, one of my favorite booktubers, but that's just me going on a tangent. So let's just append the bee from the Buzzword project. If you want to import, like we said before, you can import an SVG or an OBJ. But here we're appending from a different Blender file. So I can just do append and I can navigate to any of the files that I want to append objects from, or scenes or materials. Those are the majority of the things that I do import. So if I go to any of these, actually to the blend files, I'm going to go to the latest one and I'll hit append, but then it'll ask me what do I want to append. So it'll just open the folder for me. So I could have just double click it, I think. And I go to objects and then I find the bee and I import it. But I think because I have it in a collection, I'm going to just go to collections and I'm going to import the bee. My bee is already inside of the collection. Now, because these are not parented, so the wings are separate from the actual body of the bee, I'm going to leave the collection as it is and even hide it and select this collection, the main one, and add a collection instance, and I'll add the bee. And that's basically what I do with my bees. So the majority of the bees are actually instances of the collection, the main collection, and I keep the collection where it is in the center. And now I can rotate this one, and actually let's rotate it so it's facing us. And let's also make it a little bigger so we can see it. Now if I hit 0, this is my framing or my camera basically, and this is how it's going to look in my camera. Now, in order to add an F-curve to this, or an F-curve modifier to the keyframes, we need to add keyframes. What I do with this is have just one keyframe and then replacing it with a curve, because the curve modifiers only work if you have a keyframe. What I do is go to the object properties, and what is it that I want to make float? Usually for me, it's location and rotation, so both of them. It's going to start with these rotations, but if I apply the rotation for a collection instance, it's going to go back to its original position, which is, I think, what the bee looks like originally. So I'm going to bring it back. We don't need to apply the rotations. It's fine like this. So what I do is right click on the rotation, insert keyframe, or you can hit I and select rotation, and that will insert a keyframe at that frame. So for me, it's on frame 1 right now, and if I select rotation, then it's actually adding a keyframe for rotation. Okay, for some reason Blender crashed on me. Anyway, I redid everything and made sure to save the file so I don't lose any of the things that I've created, and then I added a keyframe for the rotation just like we did, and now we can actually see the keyframe down here. I sometimes like to go to the animation tab whenever I'm working with animations, because you get to work on this side and then they have a framing of the camera over here, and you also have the keyframes here. But the default here is the dope sheet. I don't really use the dope sheet that often. I like the timeline, which is the regular one. And let's stay here for now, just because it's much simpler to work in this framing. And now that we have a keyframe, I'll go to this side over here, to the side panel on the left, and I'll toggle this object transforms menu or properties, and I'll select any of those and I can add a modifier to it. But we cannot add a modifier from the timeline window. We can only go to the graph editor, because it's a curve and that's where curves are. That's where you adjust the speed of it. If you've ever worked in After Effects, then you'll know what graphs are. That's where you adjust the speed and values. using curves. So what we are going to do is just toggle the properties on the left side of the panel and choose any of those. We'll have to do them, or we'll have to repeat the process for all of these. Okay, now if I go to the right side of the panel, I can find the modifiers. So right now, if you actually look at the graph, it's straight. It doesn't really have any ups and downs or hills and valleys or whatever you want to call them. And if you want to scale it up and down, because before we only could see the Z property, Z rotation property, so you can scale it down. You can also go over here and just scale it up and down. And now we can actually see the X rotation, Y rotation, and the Z rotation. And this blue line is the 0 point. So before, I think we were just seeing the 0 point. These are the values. So if you look at the keyframe on the X rotation property, you're going to see that it's closer to the 80 because it's 79 degrees. So those are basically the values in the graph, and those on the top are the frames. By default, it starts with 250 frames, so it goes up to 250 and starts at 1, and you can change it from here, frame start and frame end. The majority of my animations are 120 frames, so 5 seconds, and the buzzword challenge videos are about, I think, 192 frames, because I work with a base of 24 frames per second, and so those will fit 5 seconds and 10 seconds, or actually 5 seconds and probably 8 seconds, because 10 seconds is 240. Those are my keyframes. They're very tiny. If I add another one over here, and let's say I change the rotation on the x-axis and I make it higher, and then I add insert a keyframe, then you'll see the curve going up because it goes from a value of 80, let's say, to 134. And it adds, when you insert a keyframe, or right now it's replaced because we're on a keyframe that is already inserted, you're replacing all keyframes. It's acting as all of these are one, but you can definitely insert a keyframe for only one of them. So if I right click on the X keyframe, I can say insert single keyframe, but I like to just insert them all. It's much easier. And I made the mistake of inserting one and then suddenly later one of the keyframes I inserted all of them. So it just makes it look really messy. So I just stay consistent with adding a keyframe for all of them. And note that if you change a value over here and you don't insert a keyframe, it's going to go away. If I click on the X rotation property and I go to the modifiers and I just add a modifier, I can go to noise. That is my favorite. I use the noise modifier the majority of the time, but you can definitely choose any of the other ones. Cycles just cycles through the keyframes that you already have, so it repeats them.
Tuning in from the future to adjust a longer than necessary explanation.
Briefly, cycles repeats an animation sequence. You have the option to repeat a motion by copying and pasting as is without adding actual keyframes. It goes through the keyframes you have and repeats them when it passes the last keyframe in the set, and so on, until your last signified frame. Repeat motion with offset does the same thing but increases or decreases the values of the previous set of keyframes, meaning if you move the B on the z-axis from 0 to 10, the modifier will copy the movement on the z-axis, but the values will change to 10 to 20. So it offsets the animation by 10 every time up to the end frame. The offset value is of course dependent on your initial keyframes. Repeat motion with mirror also copies the keyframes you set, but it inverts every second set of keyframes. Odd iterations will be your exact keyframe values, and even iterations will be the inverse of your values. Basically a ping-pong animation or a boomerang. You also have to pay attention that there is a before mode and an after mode. I believe the majority of us will have our keyframes from the first frame, meaning what we need is the after mode. So I want to cycle or repeat this set of keyframes after it. But let's say your frames start at the 100th position on the timeline, then you're going to need the before motion. And sometimes if it's right in the center, you also might need the after mode as well. Okay, let's go through the ones that I have used before, but we're not going to use right now because I'm trying to show you what I usually create. I think it's built-in functions. I've used the built-in functions before because it creates an oscillating movement. So if I move this right now, it's actually moving on the x-axis back and forth. What you can do is reduce the amplitude, so the rotation is a little lower, or the difference in values is lower. And you can also change the frequency. So now it's oscillating. Sine waves are really fun, especially if you build on top of each other. You can also do additive, meaning it's going to add on top of your original values. Because if you don't click this, then it goes back to 0 and it moves it from 0. But let's say I want this to add onto the value that I already have, which is 80 degrees. Then it's actually moving from there. And now I can increase the amplitude so you can actually see the oscillating movement. So that's really cool. But what I use the majority of the time is the noise modifier. Even on my creative coding account, I do use noise often. Even with textures, I use noise. It's just a random value on every frame, but each random value is not just random, it's influenced by its previous values. So it creates something really, really smooth. And that's how the majority of organic movements in animation are created. And I always choose replace, because if you add on top of it, then it's just going to go up above the value, exactly above the value. So the lowest points of the curve is going to be at about 80 degrees. And subtract will do the opposite. I like replace. I think I've used add or subtract once or twice, but the majority of the time I'm just replacing that value. So it starts at 80 and then it moves. But now, because this is extremely small, you're going to see that it's jittering instead of actually moving in an organic fluid movement. And I need to actually increase the scale. And now if I play this, and I hit space to play the animation, but you can definitely hit play animation down here. And now you can see that it's kind of like the sine wave animation, but right now it's moving more fluidly through multiple values rather than just going up and down from one value to another. I also use 2 keyframes sometimes if I want something to go from a certain point to another. So with the buzzword challenge video, the hexagon that rotates in the middle is not fully rotating 360 degrees, just going from one point to another, because that's slightly boring for certain things. And I wanted that to be a little bit more playful. So it's going from 0 to 360, but it has some variations in the rotation. So it goes a little bit back and then it goes back forward. So it's as if someone like trying to get something stuck to move on a full rotation. That's just a fun way to add something to your rotations. So now let's complete this one. For me, the majority of the time I go with the very, very high scale. So my movements are a little bit slower. Now you can actually see that it's slower. And I also reduce the strength just a little bit, holding shift again. And that will create a smoother movement. That is even barely noticeable. So let's just increase that a little bit more. Also, if you want to repeat a movement, you'll have to match the value over here on the first frame to the value over here on the last frame. And I do this with offset. So I just move it a little bit and then I try and change the scale a little bit so it fits. Now if I go to the last few frames and I move it, it's not that much of a change. They don't loop perfectly, but there's no abrupt value change from the last frame to the first frame. So that's just a way to loop your animation. I'm going to just increase this because I like it a little bit more visible. This is too big, so we're not actually seeing it right. And you can see that it goes up to about 90 degrees. And it goes down to about 60 degrees. So it's not that much of a change. Also, you can change the offset. So let's say you want a different part of the curve, then you can just do that. Maybe you like this a little bit more. And then phase is changing kind of the offset, but not really. It's saying that it's the random seed. So yeah, it's basically changing the beginning random value that continues to influence the other values in order to create this curve. And then there is also influence. So how much is this curve influencing the keyframe? So you can just reduce this. It's not similar to strength, but it's kind of similar. So you can choose this if you think the entire thing is very strong and you want to just reduce the influence. And also you can restrict the frame range. So let's say you only want this to happen at a certain point. You want this bee to go crazy at frame 100 to 140, let's say. So you can just restrict the frame range from 100 and end it at, you can definitely input the values like this to 140. Then it's going to stay, and then it's going to move then, and then it stops. And then you can also blend it in. So you don't want it to be just abrupt. Maybe you could just blend in the in point and the out point, and maybe increase the range a little bit so it's smoother. And now you can actually see that it's only happening in the middle. But of course you can increase the or decrease the scale, so it's a little bit crazier. Those are a few things that you can do with modifiers. Let's also add it to the other one. So now I can just add noise. We already know how things work. Let's go to the value over here, and let's also add it to the Z rotation. I like to offset them just to make sure that they have different values, but they don't really matter that much because they're not going to look similar. And this is just rotation. So you can definitely combine the two because that's what I did in my original video. And then you can also go to here, the first frame, insert keyframes for location, and do the same thing for the location. Add the noise modifier. It's extremely small because we're at 0 meters. So you can just definitely scale it or zoom in so you can see it. And now we have a change in location. It's really fun to play with curves or the F-Curve modifiers because it makes your work look very professional, even though it's a very simple curve that you've added to your animation. Now it's more like a bee on a flower. And you can see even the abrupt change in movement from the last frame to the first frame isn't that crazy. It's not something that you don't want happening. It's just as if the bee is just suddenly nudging itself to one side because of the wind or whatever. This week's video is very simple because F-curves are incredibly simple. They don't even require a lot of keyframes. I encourage you to play with the different curves that you find. There are also other ones that you can generate with expressions. So you can write your own mathematical expressions if you know any that will create nice curves. Then yeah, I would encourage you to do that as well. For now, I'll sign off and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.